Joining me now to discuss Stifel's chief economist, Lindsay Piegza. Lindsay, it was really interesting. As Mario Draghi spoke this morning, the stock market started to take off. And even though they didn't cut rates, he certainly has laid the groundwork for some very aggressive accommodation going forward.
Oh, absolutely. And he identified many of the same concerns and headwinds that the Federal Reserve has pointed out as risks to the outlook here in the U.S. So talking about the prospects of slower global growth, talking about concerns on the international front, international uncertainties, he said, including deteriorating trade relations, and of course, persistently low inflation, which is something that the Fed is struggling with. So while the ECB did keep rates unchanged, the expectation now is that they've opened the door for a rate reduction, taking their key refinancing rate further into negative territory come the September meeting. There's also speculation that they're willing to ramp up asset purchases again. So delving right back into the QE phase over in Europe.
Quantitative easing. Now, I know you're sort of an economic purist. Would you be okay with that if they started to buy bonds and other assets to try to, to get inflation up and put a spark in that economy?
Well, it certainly is a non-traditional policy tool, but it's something that's becoming a little less non-traditional in more recent years.
So is that a red flag, or should we be okay with it?
Well, here's the problem. We're beginning this cycle with rates already at an extremely low rate. And this isn't just the ECB. The Fed is going to be struggling with this as well. As we talk about a potential rate cut in July, you're talking about very little wiggle room to lower rates down to that zero bound before the Fed is going to have to revert to the balance sheet in order to prop up the economy. So this is something that central banks around the world are going to be struggling with. Rates are already low. Right. You can't bring them much lower. Where else are we going to find that support for the economy? So
unconventional tools are going to be conventional. Real quick, I also want to ask you, he said something I found interesting. The lingering of the uncertainty is by itself a materialization of one of the risks. In other words, these central banks are always putting on their psychiatrist hat. The idea that people are uncertain making things worse, the psychology of that, how do you factor that in as an economist?
Well, it's interesting because the Fed has a very clear mandate of stable prices, full employment. But it now seems that not just the Fed, but central banks around the world have adopted this third unofficial mandate of global and financial market stability. And when we start to see volatility spurred by uncertainty, the Fed or the ECB feels they need to step in to stabilize that. So essentially smoothing out the business cycle altogether, which certainly feels good when we're saving off of some of those troughs that can be extremely deep. But it also eliminates some of the upside and the expansion that we could have seen. And I think case in point is looking at this expansion at just 2.3% on average.
All right. But it is the longest in history, too, so it has that going for it.
The longest but the weakest.
The longest but the weakest. I don't know if we'll take that, but I think it's better than some of the alternatives. Lindsay, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks a lot.